I would like to firstly thank the Kurdish Organizations Network Coalition for the International Criminal Court for its generous invitation, the government representatives who support this just cause, as well as all the presenters here today who are sharing their stories and their work with us. My name is Suhena Mehra, and I represent the Transitional Justice Working Group, or TJWG, all the way from Seoul, South Korea. Now, you might be wondering how a South Korea-based organization came to participate in this conference. So we actually met members of the Crimes Against Kurds organization at an event several years ago. And through that one connection, we started to talk about the efforts they were making to highlight the atrocities being committed against the Kurdish people. They had never produced such a report and were unsure on how to proceed. Through our work in the North Korea space and our experience producing reports, we became fresh eyes for them. We decided to not only partner with them and help produce their landmark report, but also as a security measure for them, we published it on their behalf, printed physical copies, put out media press releases, and disseminated this report. The report uses open source documentation and interviews collected by Crimes Against Kurds, So the report uses open source documentation and interviews collected by Crimes Against Kurds to show the need for accountability for perpetrators. The report also includes recommendations for national and international action to stop ethnic cleansing and hold those responsible to account. Next slide, please. While working on this report, we realized that every community is isolated, and combining our efforts is the best way to see results. We were able to give our partners suggestions to make the report more concise, more visually impactful. We suggested visually outlining the map that you can see and highlighting which regions have suffered through killings and crop fires, as well as including images such as these that can evoke emotion in any reader across the globe, because destruction of a flag causes the same reaction no matter where you come from. It took 1.5 years to complete this report, and here is the culmination of our efforts. We were incredibly moved when we started to receive thank you messages on Facebook from Kurdish people around the world for producing this report. And I have brought this report with me. If you would like a copy, I have copies with me as well. So not only do we carry our own reports when we travel overseas, but we also carry this report and disseminate it when we can. Just this February, our director carried it to Washington, D.C. and handed it to a U.S. Congress member who was extremely appreciative of any research work that is being done in this region. They want to be able to link security issues with human rights issues, and reports like this give them a foundation to stand on when they are making decisions with their peers. So while TJWG works primarily on North Korea, we try to link our causes with other victim groups to find common aspects and expand our network. In turn, our partners support us on different initiatives, and we're able to participate in events together and garner attention through cross-cultural movement. For minority groups, it is important to not suffer alone and to join forces for the purpose of advocacy for a mutual win-win. So now I would like to quickly tell you about the core work that we do at TGWG. Next slide, please. The core work we do is documentation work. We were established in 2014, and our office is located in Seoul, South Korea. We have three main projects that I would like to tell you about. Next slide, please. Firstly, through interviewing North Korean escapees, who are now living in South Korea after escaping from North Korea, we are able to visually map out locations of killings that have taken place in North Korea. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So we have actually produced 3 mapping reports, which can be found on our website. These reports have created a very huge media impact as well. Next slide. So why do we do this work? Why should we do documentation work? By documenting state-sanctioned killings, we can provide location-based data to support accountability measures in the future. While we don't have access to North Korea at the moment, once we do, we can lay a foundation for exhumation of victims' remains and identification, and return their bodies to their loved ones. This documentation method also allows us to engage with experts and practitioners at the leading edge of scientific and technological advances that can support human rights work. Next slide, please. This is one of the maps that we have produced. As you can see, through escapee testimonies, we were able to mark police stations, airfields, ministry buildings, and so on, without being able to step into North Korea. Next slide, please. If you take a look at this map, the yellow circles, they show public executions that were held prior to 2012. The pink circles, post-2012, however, seem to retreat away into the mountains and away from public buildings. So at the top are the public buildings, the blue area, which is close to the China border, but the pink circles seem to be moving away into the mountains. This is an example of how mapping helps understand the impact of international outrage on decisions being made inside North Korea. Due to public scrutiny at the time, around 2012, as well as more availability of mobile phones, killings were moved further away into the mountains. Next slide, please. This is a close-up of the border area that I just talked about. This shows us that there are actually courthouses present near the border, but most judgments are actually made in public executions, meaning public trials, even though there's a courthouse. So these are some examples of how mapping can help us understand how regimes work, why they make the decisions they make. Next slide, please. So presently, we are continuing to work on documentation of secret or indoor killings using North Korea-focused news sources, so accessing news that North Korea puts out, and continuing to identify possible repositories of documentary evidence. And we have also started to work on mapping North Korea's chain of command structure. Next slide, please. Our second project is the Footprints database, where we showcase data of those that have been taken by North Korea. Next slide. This helps us document evidence to build a case against North Korea for enforced disappearance, abduction, and arbitrary detention. Next slide, please. So why do we do this? We do this to increase the visibility of the international nature of crimes against humanity perpetrated by North Korea. and to preserve information for the purpose of accountability and memorialization. So we also want to distribute open and impartial data to the public that's not released by any government, and to raise global and domestic attention on the issue of enforced disappearance and arbitrary detention. Next slide, please. This is what our Footprints website looks like. You can click on the tabs to access data about each category. Next slide, please. The Victims tab is visualized by year as well as location on an interactive map. So you can see how many victims have been taken by North Korea by year. Next slide. These are the victims groups that have been taken by North Korea. So of course, a lot of them are North Korean people that are continually being taken right now. And there were around 50,000 people who were taken as prisoners of war during the Korean War. Post that, there have been abductees that have been taken because they have had specialized skills. There are people who were taken from Japan as a part of the kind of scam paradise on earth. And of course, there are other foreign abductees that are continually taken, and people from China who are also taken into North Korea. Next slide. The database also has cards for each missing person, which can also be filtered. So each person's information is given here. These are the people that were taken by North Korea. Next slide. Clicking on each card shows a visual data of exactly where they were taken from. Next slide. And these are the perpetrator groups that we have in our database as well. These are the organizations, the people that have been committing these crimes. So of course it's the Ministry of State Security, the Korean People's Army, all of the North Korean ministries. Next slide, please. What we're working on next is launching 90,000 data more this summer and documenting arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance within North Korea. We will be publishing a public report this summer, and we will also be profiling the commanders who are responsible. Next slide, please. And our final project, the third and final project, is our global project. So, next slide. Access accountability, it arose from TJWG's experience as a startup NGO, seeking resources and expertise to guide the development of our structure, projects, and systems. We provide training and resources to the development of human rights documentation groups globally by identifying what are their areas of needs and matching them with expertise required to achieve their goals. Our aim is to assist these groups involved in monitoring and documenting human rights abuses in any region, and particularly those who may be looking to go ahead with the transitional justice process in their local context. So, next slide, please. Actually, this project is how we supported Crimes Against Kurds, the global project. So our flagship report highlights how machine learning and remote sensing can support human rights work. Machine learning has helped identify locations of mass grave sites in Mexico by analyzing and extracting information from press reports and generating predictions based on characteristics of locations where graves have been located. And remote sensing has helped in documentation of genocide of Rohingya people by the Myanmar military. Through the remote analysis of change in soil over time, burning of graves and other evidence, it leads to the change in topology, which remote sensing can identify and predict the existing of graves. So these are two technological tools that have helped Mexican people as well as Rohingya people to be able to work in their human rights work. So, next slide. Besides producing reports, we also conduct online and offline training. We brought together local Patani Malay human rights documenters in Thailand and participants from international organizations working on Uyghur genocide, Yemeni crisis, and conflict in Mindanao, Philippines. And we invited expert trainers who gave lectures about the following: documentation of incidents for legal use, data collection methodology, physical and digital threats, and so on. Next slide, please. So now that we have an overview of what work we do, I'd like to move on to the next topic, which is give a little bit of information about genocide in the North Korea context. Next slide. So now we already know that Genocide Convention, what it states, and any of these listed acts with intention to destroy in whole or part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, any of these acts that are committed come under the Genocide Convention. Next slide, please. But we also know that there are disputes on the interpretation of the convention, and these can be submitted to the ICJ. Next slide, please. So North Korea actually acceded to the Genocide Convention in 1989, which means there is jurisdictional ground to bring a case against it. Some of the grounds are North Korea's killings of Christians and other religionists, and North Korea's treatment of unrepatriated South Korean prisoners of war, abductees, and their descendants. They usually send them to camps, labor camps as well. And North Korea's forced abortion and infanticide against repatriated North Korean women and their children. However, the definition of genocide in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, especially the intent element and the protected group element, does not make it easy to prove the commission of genocide in a court of law. The Commission of Inquiry decided that while these crimes might be described as politicide, they were in no position to gather data and make this determination because there's no access to North Korea. Next slide, please. And I'm sure we also know what constitutes crimes against humanity. The following acts, when committed as part of widespread and systematic attack directed against any civilian population with prior knowledge of the attack. So, next slide, please. The Commission of Inquiry emphasizes that crimes against humanity in their own right are crimes of such gravity that they not only trigger the responsibility of the state concerned, but also demand a firm response by the international community as a whole to ensure that no further crimes are committed and the perpetrators are held accountable. In contrast with genocide, crimes against humanity do not need to target a specific group. Instead, the victim of the attack can be any civilian population regardless of affiliation or identity. Another important distinction is that it is not necessary to prove that there is an overall specific intent. It suffices for there to be simple intent to commit any of these acts. Next slide, please. In cases like North Korea, where there's lack of proof, we need to be strategic. North Korea's crimes against humanity, or crimes by state actors, crimes by non-state actors. These are some terms that we can use instead of genocide. On the international front, some countries refer to use the term genocide. They prefer to use the term genocide and don't want to use the term crimes against humanity. Some are uncomfortable with using the term genocide and more comfortable with using the term crimes against humanity. Thus, for us, we have found that strategically using both, depending on the situation, is what has been effective for us in the North Korea context. We attend the ICC events yearly. Some of my colleagues are in Geneva right now, and try to link North Korea issues with other country contexts. Last December, we organized the first North Korea side event at the Assembly of States Parties at the UN in New York. In collaboration with our partner organization who spoke about Ukraine issues. So, by acknowledging the suffering of one country, another country, by highlighting the crimes against humanity that continue to take place in North Korea at the same time, on the same platform, we are able to create linkage and garner international attention and support, even when the legal system might fail us. Next slide, please. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the impact of war. Lasting damage is inflicted on women and children as a result of war. History is repeating itself right now for women in this region. And I'd like to highlight the World War II Comfort Women case. Next slide, please. During Japan's occupation of Korea, Taiwan, and other territories, they conducted medical experiments on human subjects, conducted forced labor, the largest number of victims. Korean, Chinese, and Southeast Asian civilians faced gender-based violence. Military sexual slavery, known as comfort women, was perpetrated by Japan in the form of rape and other sexual violence. This is a map that represents the comfort stations that they had set up in Japanese-controlled territories in World War II. 200,000 women and girls were victims to this crime. Next slide, please. Those affected were Japanese women and girls in colonial territories, Korea and Taiwan, women and girls in occupied territories, China and Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. When Japan was tried for their crimes, the comfort women issue was not addressed, really. Although during the Batavia trials in Netherlands, we were able to establish grounds for persecution of Japan, and during the International Military Tribunal for Far East, which is known as the Tokyo trials, Japan was found guilty of committing crimes, but they made only a single reference to sexual violence and trafficking. Some have suggested that an all-male panel of lawyers and judges during this time could be a factor that led to overlooking of the gravity of crimes against women and girls. Next slide, please. The suffering of these women continued long after they left the stations. Secondary victimization by patriarchal society, physical and physiological, psychological trauma and social stigma, difficulty in marriage, pregnancy, leading to lost generations. Entire families lost their generations. Suppression of redress claims by victim states because Korea was run by dictatorships after the wars. And there was a prioritization of economical development over giving victims their redress. Next slide, please. It's only in the 1990s, when victims started to come forward and government documents were disclosed, Japanese government documents were found and disclosed, and UN started releasing reports about this issue. And the biggest impact during this time was that a Japanese cabinet secretary admitted Japan's involvement in setting up comfort stations, although the Japanese government did not. Next slide, please. The Korean Council was set up in 1990, and it made the following demands. For Japan to admit Japanese military sexual slavery system as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and grave violations of human rights. For fact-finding to include disclosure of official documents, to deliver an official apology, to pay reparations to the victims, to punish those who are responsible, to record sexual slavery system in history books, and to erect memorial monuments and build an archive. Next slide, please. However, the Japanese government's statement, even today on their website, you can Google it, it's on their website even today, forceful taking away of comfort women could not be confirmed in any of their documents that the government of Japan was able to identify. The expression sex slaves contradicts the facts, so it cannot be used. The figure 200,000 person lacks evidence. Next slide, please. So, in 2000, a women's tribunal was set up. The purpose was to gather testimony from victims and then to try groups and individuals for rape or sexual slavery by Japanese soldiers. Because this was not organized by any government or international institution, the verdict of this trial was not legally binding. The reason for holding this trial was to respond to the feelings of victims who continue to lose their case in civil lawsuits. It was an outlet for these women to express how they feel. Next slide, please. And then post that, in 2021, finally, 16 women, after filing a lawsuit in 2016, the lawsuit took place and demands for compensation were made. The second lawsuit also overturned a ruling that dismissed the case of Japan having sovereign immunity. The court ordered Japanese government to pay 200 million won in compensation for each of the former comfort women. 16 women out of 200,000 women have been compensated. And one of the youngest victims alive continues to push for this issue to be sent to the International Court of Justice. Next slide, please. When the law has been failing, activists took to advocacy work. The Statue of Peace was built across from the Japanese consulate in Busan, in South Korea. The consulate features a young girl wearing Korean clothing, sitting and staring directly at the Japanese consulate. This young girl is wearing Korean clothing and she has an empty chair next to her that represents those who are not here anymore. The Japanese government demanded for this to be removed, but as you can see, people rallied around the statue and protected it from being removed. Now there are 51 statues in South Korea and several worldwide. So where the law keeps failing these women, advocacy in this form allows for the issue to keep being pushed in the public eye. I hope that through this history, we can learn and try our best to avoid this happening again. And lastly, I would like to wrap up by saying that today's speakers and practitioners from various nations are already connected with each other. We are already connected now through mutual respect, through trust and boundless opportunities for further collaboration. This is because all that we pursue, it's better to do it together, to have better methods for recording human rights violations. I hope that this conference will allow us all to share experience, technology, knowledge, insights, and vision. We hope that the human rights defenders, record keepers, and practitioners gathered here will form a new international front and find inspiration from each other. We are always ready to take on any cause with us whenever we travel, whenever we attend any event. The Transitional Justice Working Group will strive to realize the dream of global connection for human rights and justice through strong and sustainable international and multidisciplinary cooperation. Thank you very much.